Hey folks, Barry here, Gatewaygamer, and today we're going to do a war game. Now, I went on Twitter a while back and I asked, the Twitter community in general, what is a good entry-level game to wargaming? And Joel already responded from RunThrough Reviews. He responded with 4 games: 1775, Nexus Hop, Battlelore 2nd Edition, and Band of Brothers. Okay, now I didn't want to do Memoir 44, which I do own, or Band of Brothers, which is very tough to find, because of some, personal reasons. I knew a couple guys that just recently passed away. They fought in some of these battles in World War II. They just recently passed away, 2 of them, Babe Heffron and Wild Bill Garnier. Now, eventually I do plan to do Memoir 44. I actually have filmed it once and I just didn't like it, and I'm not going to do it until I can do it justice. But anyway, out of these 4 games, there's a few other people who responded to me, Hunter over at Weapons Grade, and I think Tim and Grey Elf, and a couple others. But anyway, out of these 4 games, I picked up 1775, which is the second in a series by Agatewaygamer called The Birth of America. Okay, and takes place in the Colonial War, and basically the players are playing factions on either the British or American sides, and the object is to gain control of as many colonies as possible by the end of the 3rd or subsequent rounds. Okay, so let's get into 1775 Rebellion. Okay, in the box you get 54 cards, which are broken into 4 faction decks, consisting of the British Continental Army, the Loyalist Militia, and the Patriot Militia. You get 205 unit cubes, 35 red for the British regulars, 45 yellow for the Loyalist Militia, 40 blue for the Continental Army, 45 white for the Patriot Militia, 12 orange for the Hessians, 10 purple for the French, and 18 green for the Native Americans. You also get 16 battle dice, 2 red for the British regulars, 3 yellow for the Loyalist Militia, 2 orange for the Hessian mercenaries, 2 blue for the Continental Army, 3 white for the Patriot Militia, 2 purple for the French regulars, and 2 green for the Native Americans. There are also 16 double-sided control markers, 4 turn markers, 1 in each faction's color, 1 round marker, 1 bag, 1 rule book, 2 player aids, and the board. Okay, folks, welcome to 1775 Rebellion. Okay, so 1775 is basically an area control game where players will play factions of either the American or British Army. Now, the end of the game is triggered when the truce card from both factions of one army are played at the end of the 3rd or subsequent rounds. When the end of the game is triggered, players will finish out that round, and then players will count the number of colonies each army controls, and whichever army has the most colonies under their control wins the game. If there is a tie, the United States becomes a southern province of French Canada, and neither player wins. We will be playing the standard campaign for 1775 Rebellion. Players will control factions in either the English or the American armies, and the number of players will determine how many factions each player will control. For a 2-player game, each player will control 2 factions, 2 for the English and 2 for the Americans. In a 3-player game, 1 player will play both factions of one army, and the other players will play 1 faction each of the opposing army. And finally, for a 4-player game, each player will play 1 faction. Now, there are 4 basic factions in the game. First we have the British regulars, which are represented by these red cubes. Teaming up with the British regulars will be the Loyalist militia, which are represented by these yellow cubes. For the American forces, we have the Continental Army, which is represented by the blue cubes. And teaming up with the American Continental Army are the Patriot militia, which are represented by these white cubes. Each army also has an allied army. For the English, we have these orange cubes, which represent the Hessian army. And the Americans are allied with the French, which are represented by these purple cubes. There's one final independent faction, which are these green cubes representing the Native Americans. They are an independent faction which can ally with either the American or British armies. And we'll get into how that works in a little bit. Now, at the beginning of the game, each player will get a deck of faction cards. During setup, each faction wants to build their deck. And this is done depending on the scenario, okay? For the basic scenario for 1775, players will look on the face side of the card. Down on the bottom right side of the card, we will see a number. And they will use any cards numbered 1 through 12. Any cards that are greater than 12, they will discard into the box. They will not be used for the game. For the Siege of Quebec, players will look on the top right corner of their card, and they will see a little symbol with a floret. These will be used for that particular campaign. There are 3 basic types of cards in the game. First we have event cards, then we have movement cards, and finally we have truce cards, which are actually special movement cards. And we'll get into how these cards work in a little bit. When players receive their faction deck, they want to draw 3 cards off the top of this deck. This will make their hand. Okay, during setup and then at the end of each round, the players always want to draw up the 3 cards in their hand. These 3 cards must include a minimum of 1 movement card. If they do not, the player would show the rest of the players their hand and then shuffle those 3 cards back into their faction deck and draw 3 new cards to put in their hand until they have a hand with at least 1 movement card in it. Along with the faction deck, you want to give players the battle dice for the appropriate faction, along with any cubes that represent that faction's units. You also want to give each team one of these player aids. And then we want to keep all the French, Hessian, and Native American units handy, along with the control markers, so we can use them throughout the game. Okay, for this playthrough, I'm going to keep them off camera. You also want to keep handy any allied battle dice, along with the Native American battle dice. We also want to take our 4 turn markers, which are just blank dice of the corresponding faction's color, and place them in this black bag. Okay. Now essentially the board is set up the same way each time you play the game. Now the map is broken up into the original 13 colonies that most Americans are aware of, with the exception of Maine, which was once a territory of Massachusetts, and then Quebec and Nova Scotia, which are considered to be colonies in this game, but only for gameplay. The creators of the game took some creative license. Now each colony is defined by this solid black line that goes around the perimeter of the colony. Furthermore, the colonies are broken up into territories, which is represented by this dashed line, or by waterways. Now a special note should be taken with the amount of territories in several of the colonies. First in Quebec here, we have 5 territories. This big one up top, the 2 below that, and then the 2 below that, which are separated by the St. Lawrence River. New York here has 9 territories in it. We got the 2 up top, 2 below that, and we have 4 below the top 4. And finally we have this stretch of land here where New York City is, for a total of 9 territories. And finally we have Virginia, which is broken up into 7 territories. We have the 2 up north here, then 2 below that, and 2 below them, And then also the Virginia Peninsula here, just across from Norfolk, is considered a territory itself, even though it is not attached to the mainland of Virginia. Now, every game will essentially start off the same. In certain territories in each colony, you'll see printed cubes of a faction color on the colony territory. When you set up the board, you will place the appropriate amount of cubes for the appropriate faction in those colony territories. Now we know that a colony is controlled by a certain army by these control markers, which are double-sided. One side depicting the English army, the opposite side depicting the American army. Along with the faction units being placed in each territory, there are certain colonies that already are controlled by one army or the other. Quebec, Nova Scotia, and Delaware will be controlled by the English, and then Rhode Island and Connecticut will be controlled by the American forces. Now, one additional setup step for the standard campaign in 1775 is to place additional troops for each faction for both armies. Now, this is not to be confused with the reinforcement stage, which we'll get into a little bit. This is part of the initial setup. To place additional forces on the board, we will draw one of these turn markers out of the bag, in this case the British regulars, and that faction will place 4 of their units in a territory where either they have units or their partnering faction has units. So we'll place a few here in Delaware and a few here in Halifax. Once that is done, their partnering faction will place 4 of their units in a territory that is controlled by either them or their partnering faction. Okay, so we'll put some for the Loyalists in Boston and then Princeton. Now, the opposing army will go and do the same thing, one faction at a time. Once that step has been done, we will then take our turn markers and place them back into the black bag. Now the final thing we want to do for setup is make sure that the round marker is on the first space of the track here, on number 1, and we are ready to play 1775 Rebellion. Now, players will take turns commanding their army. Each turn is broken up into 4 phases. First we have the reinforcement phase, then we have the movement phase, followed by the battle phase, and finally we have the card drawing phase. At the beginning of each round, players will determine the turn order by drawing their turn marker out of this bag. So when the first round comes along, somebody will draw the first marker out of this bag, and that will say who will go first. Then that player will complete their turn, and another player will draw another turn marker out of the bag to see who goes next. And it will continue until all 4 factions have played their turn. The first phase of a player's turn is the reinforcement phase. In the reinforcement phase, players will take 4 additional units of their corresponding faction color and place them in a city, which is depicted by this symbol here, in a colony that they control, again depicted by the control marker. Now players can choose to place 1 or all of their units in these cities, or they can spread them out over several cities as long as the city is in a colony that they control. So I'll place 2 units in Dover and then 2 units up here in Montreal in Quebec. Again, it is in a city territory that is in a colony that the English control. Although this will not happen on the first turn, but it can happen on subsequent turns. If there are any fled units in the fled unit box here, you will place them just like you would place a reinforcement troop. Okay, again, in a city, in a colony that you control. However, Hessian and Native American troops cannot be placed during the reinforcement phase unless there is a specific card that will allow you to do so. Okay, the second phase in a player's turn is the movement phase. In the movement phase, a player will take 1 movement card from their hand and play that card. Now, players can only play one and only one movement card during each turn. Now, all cards in 1775 are set up the same. They have the artwork up top, the type of card underneath that. Below that, there are a set of symbols. Every movement card has a symbol of a soldier standing on a circle. These soldiers represent the armies that you will be in control of throughout the game. Okay? Now, an army is any number of units which are individual cubes in a territory of your control. There are three types of movement cards in the game. First, we have water movement cards. Now, water movement cards are broken up into two different categories, but we'll start off with the warship movement. Now, the warship movement card will allow you to take one army and move them from one territory adjacent to water to another territory adjacent to water, which is depicted by the soldier standing on one circle with an arrow pointing to another circle with a blue circle in between. Now, this could be any territory adjacent to water from one location to another. Take note that the Atlantic Ocean down here does connect to the St. Lawrence River up here, but there are a few rules concerning that, and we'll get into that in a second. So, say I play this warship movement card. I could take one army from a territory that is under my faction's control, as long as I have one unit of my faction in that army, and I can move them to another territory adjacent to water, whether it be a territory that my faction or my allied army controls, or into an enemy controlled territory. There is a second type of warship movement card which depicts two of these sets of symbols with a plus sign in between. What this means is you could take two armies from two different territories adjacent to water, and you can move those two armies to two different territories adjacent to water, or you could choose to move them to the same territory adjacent to water. It's your choice. Now, with this type of warship movement card, I could take two armies from a territory adjacent to water and move them to two separate territories adjacent to water, even if they are under enemy control. So say I went from Dover here to New Jersey, and then I went from New York City here and reinforced Boston. Okay. The second type of water movement card is the boat movement card. Now, boat movement cards work a little different than the warship movement cards. As you can see, they have a similar symbol system than the warship movement card, with the difference being that there are 3 cubes above the soldier and there's a 2x above the arrow. What that means is you could take two armies consisting of 3 units and move them to a territory adjacent to water. But unlike the warship movement card, these two armies of 3 units must land at the same territory adjacent to water. They can come from 2 separate territories, but they must land on the same territory. Now, the 3 units that these two armies can take with them are either 3 of the same faction type, 1 of the active faction type, and then 2 of either the allied faction or an allied army of that faction, or a combination of the 3 different types of units. Say the Loyalists were playing this boat movement card here. They could take 2 armies of 3 units and move them to 2 territories adjacent to water, as long as they land in the same territory. So, say one army here came from Boston, consists of the Loyalists and then 2 regulars, and they landed here in New London. And then another army of 3 units came from Dover and landed in New London. They can do that as long as they land in the same territory. I could also take an army of nothing but Loyalists and an army of loyalists and then each of their allied factions, okay? Whichever combination you choose to, as long as there is at least one loyalist in that army. Once a water movement card is played, you would simply discard that into a discard pile. It will no longer be used in the game. Next we have land movement cards. Now these are similar to water movement cards, as in they have artwork up top, followed by the type of card, in this case a movement card, and then they have symbols underneath representing the armies and an arrow with a number below it, which represents how many territories that army can move to. Now players do not have to move at all, and they do not have to move the full extent of the territories depicted on the card. They can choose to do either none or all. It's up to them. Now there's a couple rules with land movement. First, an army is, like I said before, consists of any amount of units within a territory, okay? Now, these armies can be broken off into smaller armies and moved into different territories. But a player's faction must have one unit in these armies in order to move them. Now, if an army moves into a territory that is controlled by either the active faction or an allied faction, they can continue to move through that territory into another territory. They can also move into or through an unoccupied territory. During movement, you cannot, however, drop off units and continue to move on, or pick up units and continue to move on. If an army enters a territory that is controlled by the opposing army, they must stop, and then once all their movement is done for different armies, they will enter the battle phase, which we'll get into in a second. If a player's army moves into a territory with Native Americans, they must also stop. And if the Native Americans are in a territory without an opposing army's faction in it, they will ally with your army. Now there's two rules involving terrain in your movement phase. The first one is a player cannot cross any waterway, whether it be a river or ocean, unless they are playing a water movement card. However, they can cross a river if there are these gray areas, which are called land bridges. If there are one of them, as in the case just south of Fort Ticonderoga, they can then move from one territory over the river to another. That's all the terrain rules you have to worry about. So, let's say the British regulars here are going to move 2 armies up to 3 territories away. Okay, now they could take 2 armies of as many units as they choose, as long as there is 1 unit of the active faction, in this case the Loyalists, in that army. Okay, and they can move them any which way they want to, as long as they abide by the number of territories they can move to depicted by the card. Okay, so we take one from Princeton here, go into northern Pennsylvania, and then another one from New York, and go further up into New York. Okay, now even though there is a river here, it ends, so the land wraps around it. This is not actually crossing the river, you're just going around the river. Once you have played one of your land movement cards, you simply discard it into a discard pile. It will no longer be used in the game. Now, the final movement card is the truce card. And again, it's set up the same way as any other card in the game. You have artwork up top, the name of the card underneath that. Below that are symbols on how many troops you can move and how many territories away you can move them. And below that, every truce card says the Treaty of Paris. Now, once you have played this card and moved your armies around, depending on what the card says and how you want to do it, you would not discard the truce card. Instead, you will place it near the board where everybody can see it. This will trigger the end of the game, okay? And we'll get into how that works a little later on. Okay, the final type of card in the game is event card. Now, event cards are set up like other cards, They have artwork on the top. They have the type of card below that, the event. They differ a little bit from then on. Below the type of card, they will have the name of the card. Below that, they will have the specific ability that card will allow you to do. Below that text, they tell you in which phase you could play these cards. And then finally, below that, they have some historical background text. Now, these event cards will allow you to do several different things in the first 3 phases of the game. Okay? Through event cards, you will be able to deploy Native American, Hessian, and French armies. Okay? And you would do that during the reinforcement phase. And you would place them in a city, in a colony that you control. The event cards also allow you to reinforce fled units of either Hessian or Native Americans. They do not allow you to reinforce fled units of the French because the French do not flee. And we'll get into that into the battle phase in a little bit. They could do other things like allow you to take a unit of an opposing faction and change that unit into one of your units, removing the opposing faction unit from the board. Or they could allow you to move into or through more territories during the movement phase. They vary depending on the faction and the card. So say the British regulars played this Joseph Brant card here. That would allow them to place 2 Native American units in a colony that they control in a city territory, and then 2 fled Native American units, again, in a colony in a city space that they control. And this is done during the reinforcement phase. Once the card is played, you simply discard it from the game. It's no longer used. So now we enter the battle phase. Okay? During battle, a player's faction will take a number of the player's faction's battle dice equal to the number of units of that faction until they reach the maximum amount of battle dice that faction has. Now there's 3 symbols that can be rolled during a battle. There's hit, flee, and then this blank face represents a command decision. If a player rolls a hit symbol, the opposing army would choose 1 unit per die with the hit symbol rolled and remove 1 unit from the board. The unit is considered to be destroyed. Now that player can choose any type of unit it wishes to. If the flee symbol is rolled, the faction that rolled that die has to remove 1 unit for every die rolled and place that unit in the fled unit box. If a command decision is rolled, for every command decision die that is rolled, a player can choose 1 unit of the corresponding faction to the battle die and decide on whether to leave them in battle, move them to an unoccupied territory, move them to a territory that is controlled by an allied faction or an allied army, or they can move those units to a territory that is controlled by Native Americans. If they do so, they would then ally with the Native Americans. If a command decision is rolled and the unit cannot move to a territory because it is under enemy control, they must simply stay where they are. They cannot flee by sea. Now, battle dice must be resolved in this order: hits, flee, and then command decision. When rolling battle dice, you can roll as many dice as you have of the corresponding faction unit, up to the maximum battle dice that faction has. If there are multiple players rolling for an army, each player would roll their faction dice simultaneously. So, here we have a battle between the English forces, which consist of 2 British regulars, 2 Loyalist militia, 2 Native Americans that allied with the British, and 2 Hessian units, which are attacking the American forces, which consist of 3 Patriot militia units and 2 Continental Army. The defender will always roll first. So in this case, the American Army can roll 3 Patriot militia battle dice and 2 Continental Army battle dice because they have that respective number of units. They would then roll and resolve the dice. Again, we resolve it with hits, followed by flees, and then command decisions. So, let's say this was the result. We have 2 hits. The English Army would have to determine which 2 units they wish to remove from the board. So let's say they have 1 of their Loyalists and 1 of their Hessians. Now we move into the fleet units, and since the Continental Army rolled the fleet dice, they must put 2 units in the fled unit box. And then the Patriot Militia could choose 1 unit to resolve the command decision. Being that this territory here is unoccupied, they will move 1 unit from Trenton up to Princetown. So then it will move on to the attacker, and they would roll as many dice as they have units on there, up to the maximum amount of dice they have. So in this case, the English here have 2 Native Americans, which allied with them, 1 Hessian, 1 Loyalist, and then 2 British regular. They would then roll their dice and resolve the dice. And then it'll go back to the defender. And this will go on until one side is eliminated and 1 army has sole control of that territory. Now, if there are more than 1 battle being planned, you would then move on to the next battle and resolve that one the same as you just seen done here. Now, there is a special rule for Native Americans during the battle phase. Native Americans do not like to fight each other, so Native Americans will flee from each opposing army in equal numbers. Okay, so say we have the British here, which are allied with 2 Native American units, and the American Army, which are allied with 3 Native American units. Each force would lose an equal number of Native Americans, in this case 2 each, and these Native Americans would flee and be placed in the fled unit box. Any number greater than the number of Native Americans that fled will still be allied to whichever opposing army they were allied with. And then you commence battle as normal. Now, if a Native American is left in a territory, whether due by movement or battle result, those Native American units once again become a neutral faction. If a colony has an opposing army in it, or a Native American army in it, they will not have control of that colony. Okay? However, if an army is the only army in that colony, even though there are several unoccupied territories in the colony, that army will gain control of the colony. The final phase of your turn is drawing cards. You would draw back up to 3 cards in your hand. Again, if you do not have any movement cards in this hand at 3, you would show the other players your hand, shuffle these cards back into your faction deck, and then draw 3 new cards until you have a hand of at least 1 movement card in it. Once your turn is over, a player will draw another turn marker out of the bag, and so on until every faction has taken their turn. Once all 4 factions has taken their turn, you would then move the round marker to the next round, replace the turn markers back into the bag, and then a player would draw to see who goes first for the next round. Okay? And this will continue until you can check for the end of game trigger, okay? Which happens at the end of the 3rd or subsequent rounds. To check for the end of the game trigger, you would see if one army has played both of their faction truce cards. If that has happened, players will continue to finish out the round, and then they will count to see how many colonies each army controls. The army with the most colonies in their control wins the game. If there's a tie, the United States becomes a colony of French Canada, and there are no winners. And that is how you play 1775 Rebellion.